So, welcome back to part 9 of our Bible study looking at John's Gospel. Now looking in Lent and Easter, March and April, at the second half when when John describes Jesus' suffering, death and resurrection. We're now at chapter 15, and remember the context for this is Jesus talking to his disciples about how that life, that existence, that way of being that he's set up through the first half of John's Gospel will be allowed to continue even once he's left them in bodily form, left us in bodily form, through the gift of his promised Spirit. And that's where this language of being the true vine comes from, and abiding in Jesus. And that word abide is critical for John, is so important for John to describe that way that our relationship with Jesus is sustained even when Jesus is no longer with us in bodily form. We abide through the Spirit in Jesus. And that the Spirit is often paired with fruit, with being fruitful, as it is here. So without the central vine, the branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides, unless it has the Spirit. And Paul very often talks about the fruits of the Spirit. And I do think that's a helpful image. It's one which we use a lot through our liturgy and our conversation. About bearing the fruits of the Spirit, i.e. This life that we live in Jesus actually should have some visible effects which we can share with others. They bring beauty and love and faithfulness and gentleness and all those other things that Paul describes as fruits of the Spirit. Well, that language is here in John's Gospel as well. 15:7, and words abide as well, and we shouldn't forget that John's used that language a lot as well, and that will become important throughout the Passion narrative about the words that we use. Remember, Jesus is the Word, and that's always been important. So what is said and what is written abides in Jesus as well as taking on that flesh. The flesh and blood that give us human life. Now in 15:12 onwards, Jesus returns to the language of commandment when he raises it in verse 10, but then continues about, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." This is what we heard back in John 13. But now he says, if you do this, I don't call you servants, but I call you friends. So he's not saying that what he did in washing the disciples' feet or what Mary did in anointing his feet was not service, but it was not the work of a servant. As we said, it wasn't work at all. It was an act of love, an act of compassion, and therefore he calls us friends. So he's saying that actually this relationship of love, of service, of humility is about being on an equal with one another, even with Jesus himself. And that's such a powerful thing to say, that his power is not used manipulatively or abusively, as we will see others in the rest of this story using their power. But actually, he calls us friends. He puts us on an equal footing. He gives us power. He gives us the freedom to make our own decisions. And that is why we can call our relationship love and not something else. So I call you friends because we have a shared vision, a shared understanding, and a shared power to make that vision happen. So love preserves that communion, that power balance between the disciples, between Jesus, between us, and between the members of the church. Love preserves that balance. And importantly, that's a choice. So we have that choice to love. And when he goes on in verse 18 onwards, then to talk about those who've chosen to do something else, to hate, to turn away from God, that's their decision. Who are they? John doesn't define that, not in this passage. They are those who choose to turn away from God. God chooses us, and we must choose to follow him. We have that reciprocal choice, that reciprocal freedom that is so important for our identity as people created in God's image. But in order to make that choice and to make a good choice, that's why we need this testimony. That's why we need this witness. That's why we need the writings to be passed on. And that's why we need the advocate to testify on Jesus' behalf, and the disciples to do that too. That's verses 26 and 27. So that in order to encourage others to make good choices, we must play our part in testifying to this new life that Jesus offers us. And then 16:4, it's also therefore for us, not seeing testimony anymore if we've received and made that choice to follow Jesus, but actually remembering what he has told us. So testimony and remembrance are both crucial to our continued decision to desire to follow God, to choose to love God, to do his commandments. We said before that the Spirit brings joy and peace, but actually Jesus knows that reality is not always the case. So because he has said these things to you, he knows that sorrow has filled their hearts, but he's encouraging them to see the bigger picture, see the end game, when joy and peace will come in fulfillment. That's what we see in this narrative. And again, that's one of the benefits of reading this narrative all the way through, is you see it build up, and you see that actually that process of becoming one with Christ, that process which we might call sanctification, or atonement, or unification, theosis. There's lots of different words to describe this process of becoming one with God, which brings us that joy and that peace. Jesus also calls the Spirit of truth, and therefore we must hold on to the truth of that promise. And truth again is an important word for John. That's what we're remembering and testifying to, is the truth of the promise which Jesus gives us. The rest of chapter 16 talks about this promise, the sorrow turning into joy, the little while, the waiting, the being patient for that to happen. And then he leaves the disciples, and this is the final word that he speaks directly to them. He's going to pray in their presence, and he'll say things to them as they make their way through the Garden of Gethsemane and towards the stone pavement. But this is the last in this farewell discourse that he says to them, and his last word is a word of peace. I have said this to you, John 16:33, so that in me you may have peace. And we know that word "in" is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. This abiding, this peace-bringing process, which will be their choice to pursue, even when he is not bodily there with them, and is our choice to take up as well. That brings us to the end of these chapters of John, before we turn to Jesus' final prayer, and then his experience of arrest, trial, death and resurrection. So that concludes the 3 sessions for March. We'll pick up with chapter 17 in April, and go on from there. So thank you for reading John's Gospel with me, and I hope you'll continue in the next session.